Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is a historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s for LaRouchePAC. That's LaRouchePAC.com. And I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Dave, I'm happy to be back on with you.
Hey, thanks for being here. And there's a lot going on, not just here in the United States, but throughout the world, actually, I see. And I wanted to start off with the EU and what has been going on there with France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands. What is your take? I mean, you're on the front lines, you're in Germany. What has been going on out there, and what are people looking at when they see the EU? What do they see when they're looking at the other countries? Are they all banding together to say, you know something, it's time to leave the EU? Or are they saying, let's stay with the EU?
Well, I think you have to start by recognizing that there's something happening throughout the world. There is a global insurgency against what we might call the transatlantic establishment or the globalist banking elite. There's a revolution against them. And on the one side, you have a positive development, which is the Eurasian perspective, the China, Russia, India, New Silk Road perspective. In terms of the West, you have one country after another with voters expressing their anger and rage against it. We saw this with Brexit. We saw it with the Trump victory. We saw it with the big defeat for Prime Minister Renzi in Italy, and the Italians are now moving toward the exit. We see it in France, where the incumbent president Hollande had to drop out. He's running at about 3% in the polls. And in Germany, we see it with Merkel in trouble. I mean, Merkel right now is in the neck-and-neck race with a not very particularly good guy, Martin Schulz, from the Social Democrats. But people are very disgruntled. Now, why is that the case? Well, you can look at the United States and extend it into Europe. There was never a recovery after 2008. There were a bunch of lies that were peddled by Obama, that are peddled by the European Union, that say we're having a recovery, it's a slow recovery, but we're creating jobs, things are getting better. And most people know that's not true. And you know it's not true because the number of jobs that are created include temporary, low-wage, and part-time jobs. The only thing that's ticking up these days is the stock market. People are in financial trouble. Debt is growing, both in terms of government debt, but also private and corporate debt. Banks are in terrible shape. And in Europe, you have the situation where the largest bank, Deutsche Bank, is in very significant trouble. The British banks, led by Royal Bank of Scotland and HSBC, are in trouble. The French banks, the Italian banking system's bankrupt. And we now have the specter of Greece again. You know, another bailout. Greece is still unable to pay their debts, so they're going to loan them another 90 billion euros. So in terms of the European situation, what I'm finding is a great deal of interest in what's happening in the United States. People who initially were reading in the media that Trump is crazy, Trump is dangerous, Trump wants war, are now asking the question, why is the establishment so desperate to try and get rid of Trump? What's he doing? There must be some other story there. And so I've had doors open for me to go in and talk to people who are asking the question, well, what could we do this in Germany? Could we make a change in Germany? And underlying it, and I think this is the important point, Dave, is there was no recovery. We're potentially heading for a bigger crash than in 2008. And when I say potentially, it's going to happen. Unless there's a change in the fundamentals, we will have another crash, and it will be bigger. And they're going to have a hard time bailing it out this time. So I think under those circumstances, people are looking for an alternative.
You know, Harley, you talk about a coming crash, and we know that Obama and Boehner, they made a deal that, you know, they won't revisit the debt ceiling problem until after Obama was out of office, coming up this year in March. And we can see already that everything's going to freeze at this point. Now, Trump has been very vocal about what happened last time where he didn't want the debt ceiling to be raised. And we're coming to that point once again. From your understanding of what you see, where do you think this is going to go? Do you think he's going to actually raise it once again? And do you think Congress will raise it? Or do you think it's just going to stay, shut down and that's it?
Well, it's very hard to predict what Trump will do. I think there's going to be a lot of hand-wringing and craziness and late-night meetings going on. But in terms of what they can do, will they move toward a government shutdown or not? That seems to be the question, but I'll take it on a different level. The problem with the debt ceiling debate is that it doesn't take up the question of how we could reverse the so-called fundamentals so that this wouldn't be a problem. The problem with the debt ceiling is we no longer have a physical economy backing up either our currency or the dollar, the economy. We've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs since 2000. Now, Trump is talking about reviving the industrial economy, breaking with the free trade deals that caused us to lose these industrial jobs. If he does that and does it quickly, then you could do a one-time deal and say, well, we'll raise the debt ceiling, but the idea is going to be the way we're ultimately going to bring the problem of debt under control is by producing again, is by reviving the physical base of the U.S. economy. So if he does proceed to do that, as he indicated he would, he has junked the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He'll probably junk TTIP with Europe. If you were to go with Glass-Steagall, as Sean Spicer said the other day, he's still committed to, so that you start to deal with the banking crisis, then you could bring the debt situation under control. But if you just go into debt to pay debt, as you know, Dave, that never works. It just makes the situation worse. And then when you add a layer of austerity on top of that, all you're doing is further reducing the ability of the country to eventually pay the debt. So I think the things that Trump has to look at is getting a physical recovery going and maybe writing down some of the debt through an offshoot of a Glass-Steagall bill.
Yeah, I mean, I understand him trying to bring jobs back and trying to revitalize the infrastructure and the manufacturing infrastructure of the United States. But it's been years where manufacturing jobs have been, offshored. And right now, it doesn't seem like we have the infrastructure to handle what he wants to do, especially in this really weak economy. I mean, the economy, to me, seems like it was just one gigantic manipulation. And what we're looking at is not really true. So we're not really looking at the real unemployment. We're really not looking at the real GDP. And I feel like he's going to be, I don't know how fast he can do this.
Well, this is the problem. And it's also the problem when you bring in someone like Steve Mnuchin to the Treasury Department, when Mnuchin is a Goldman Sachs Soros mole. But this is the problem he's got to face. He told the American people he's going to deal with this Obama economy. And he's been fairly straightforward and I think accurate in saying that this is a mess. As you just pointed out, it's worse than weak. It's cratering. We've had 5 years now of quantitative easing on top of the bailouts before that. The big banks are larger than ever, and the small and regional banks, because of the quantitative easing Federal Reserve commitment to the big banks, there's no credit to the smaller banks, which feed the real economy. On top of which, they're hampered by the Dodd-Frank regulatory system, which makes it almost impossible for them to comply with the accounting procedures. So he's got to move very quickly. As he said, he wants to deconstruct Dodd-Frank. He should bring a bill to do that immediately. He should bring Glass-Steagall back immediately. And then say that we're going to revive lending through the commercial banking system. And then use that, not through the Federal Reserve, but through a Hamiltonian credit system like John Kennedy was trying to do before he was killed. A Hamiltonian credit system which would produce credit for the infrastructure building and then move like hell on that. And in that, he had this interesting meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who pledged to provide $10 to $15 billion of infrastructure funds to the United States. The Chinese are talking about collaborating with the United States on reviving infrastructure here. If he does those things, we come up against the problem that you identified just a minute ago. Do we have enough skilled labor to put this kind of process together? We're not just talking about filling potholes or putting some toll booths in. A real 21st century infrastructure means new technologies. It means high-speed rail. It would mean upgrading the water and power systems of this country. And it's a real question as to whether we still have enough of a skilled labor force to do that. Most of the skilled machine operators in this country are 60 years old or older. We don't have very many millennials in the younger generation who are trained to run lathes and various kinds of machine tool processes. So it is a real problem. It's a race with time, but he shouldn't lose time on this by getting into a gridlock over the debt ceiling. I would say that the priority has to be Glass-Steagall and credit for infrastructure. And then we'll see if that can work. I will add one point on this, Dave, that, all the discussion about China from a year ago, is the China bubble popping? Is the Chinese banking system overextended? Does the infrastructure program really work? Well, in the last couple of months, there have been two reports, one from The Economist, which is not exactly a reliable source, but the other from PricewaterhouseCoopers on the Chinese infrastructure plan. And what it said is that their continued investment in cutting-edge technologies, combined with taking the air out of the bank bubble, the stock bubble that they created, has put China on a solid course toward growth. And I think this is something that Jack Ma presented to Trump, and Trump was impressed by it. And he's actually changed his tune a little bit on what he wants to do with China. So all these things mean that he's got to move quickly. And the other thing, of course, that's hampering him is that you have the deep state, for lack of a better term, in the form of the CIA, the NSA, the intelligence services, the Obama, Hillary Clinton crowd, the Soros crowd, and then foul balls in the Republican Party like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who are going after him with their knives out. And then, of course, the mainstream media. So he's fending off this deep state coup on the one hand, while he's trying to put together his foreign policy and his domestic economic policy. But I think you kill two birds with one stone by going after the banks with Glass-Steagall and with a major infrastructure program, and that will buy him some time.
I mean, Harley, I was thinking the same thing when you were mentioning all of this and we were talking about how we can bring back manufacturing, bring back jobs. I'm thinking of the other side of the deep state, of the central bank, because we know the Fed has been talking about raising the interest rates at least, 3 times this year. Back in 1937, they actually raised the rates into a weak economy. And right now we're in a very weak economy. And it looks like when they do this type of tightening, it looks like they're setting it up to fail. I mean, that's what I see right now.
Oh, absolutely. Look, first of all, a lot of these so-called economists at the Fed are idiots who are basically, they have their jobs because they have degrees from the last 20 years at universities, which are teaching nonsense. The whole monetary theory school, which Janet Yellen came through, and Bernanke and Mario Draghi in Europe at the European Central Bank, this is nothing but a Goldman Sachs, Rothschild, J.P. Morgan Chase operation to increase the power of the largest banks, the universal banks, and has nothing to do with the real economy. So they're in a total crisis. This is why they've kept interest rates low, because they know if they start raising interest rates, it's going to screw up the bond market. It might pop the stock market bubble, which is the only claim they have to a recovery right now. And so whatever gain they would get from raising the rates would be lost by the collapse of what's left of industry and trade. So the problem is that all the axioms of modern economic theory, the so-called rocket science of derivatives and everything else, is nothing but a scam, a Ponzi scheme, as you say, like we saw in the 20s. And the attempt to apply standard monetary theory to this will not work. You've got to go back a little further to the idea of physical economy of Alexander Hamilton in the American Revolution. This is what LaRouche has been arguing since the end of the Bretton Woods system in August 1971. Unless you go to some kind of fixed exchange rate and a system of credit which goes into your productive sector, all you're dealing with is monetary policy, which is entirely controlled by the big banks for the big banks. You know, to paraphrase Lincoln, you have government of, by, and for the biggest banks. And it doesn't work. They're not geniuses. They've screwed up everything they've touched. Now, the other side of this is that are they willing to pull the plug to stop Trump because they fear that Trump may actually apply an economic nationalist program that will work? And I think there's a real possibility that if Trump were to go with Glass-Steagall, they'd pull the plug. I mean, we saw yesterday, or was it Thursday, when Sean Spicer reiterated in a press briefing that Trump wants Glass-Steagall, the market fell dramatically, and it was blamed on the comments on Glass-Steagall. I think that may be true.
I agree with you. And I think it's a race to see who's going to actually bring the economy down. Because when I look at the economy and I see what Trump is doing, and some things I agree with, some things I completely don't agree with, but I see that he's a businessman. He has businesses that were successful. He has businesses that failed, and he knew that, okay, I have too much debt. I can't keep it going. There's no way. I have to go bankrupt. And when he said the economy is a complete mess, I think he didn't want to come out to the public and say, okay, we're doomed here. I mean, the economy with the debt and what's been going on is just...
Well, Dave, we could say he knows a bankruptcy when he sees one.
Yes, that is true. And I think he's seeing that now. And I think right now it's a race to see who is going to bring the system down first and who's going to be blamed on bringing it down. I think he wants to bring it down his way to show the people, you know, we were in a lot of trouble. This system has to be reset some way, somehow. And I think the deep state, the central bank, they're trying to do it their way. And I think there's a battle going on. I mean, there's a battle going on with a lot of things, but there's going to be a battle going on moving forward.
You're making an important point, which is there's no difference between the City of London, Wall Street banks, the Federal Reserve System, and the deep state. They are totally intricately intertwined, and one doesn't function without the other. This is why you had such a long history of Wall Street bankers going into the CIA, beginning with Allen Dulles. You know,
Yes.
the lawyers who come out of these so-called white shoe firms on Wall Street who end up as intelligence operatives. You know, and what are they protecting? They're protecting what used to be called a gentleman's agreement between London and the United States to loot the world and to use that loot to back up fraudulent trading. Now, they ran out at a certain point of places to loot. And some countries started to say, we don't want you anymore. You have rebellions against the International Monetary Fund. You have the emergence of China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa with the BRICS, the new development bank of the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are not large enough at this point to replace the IMF system and replace the Wall Street London system. But as you're saying, the London Wall Street system is collapsing. And the problem the deep state has is how do they keep things together while there's a rebellion underway? And they had counted on Hillary being elected and trying to escalate the threats against Russia and China to force them to come in and underwrite the collapsing Western system. And Putin was not about to do that. Xi Jinping is not about to do that. The Indians are not about to do that. And with Trump, they're looking at Trump saying, well, maybe there's a chance we could work with the United States. I think it's really fascinating that the shift from Trump on China just in the last month, from the so-called two China policy to reiterating the one China policy, what did he call them, currency manipulators, to now saying we can do business, we can do deals. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi saying There's a transformation going on between U.S.-China relations. Here's something which could work, but it is a race for time because, as you can see, the deep state is not going to stop. And they don't care if they're making things up. They have this whole new narrative of fake news. Where's the real fake news? It's that Putin somehow elected Trump. There's nothing more fake than that, and yet you read the New York Times, it's as though it's been proven in court. So this question of a race for time is important. Now, what Mr. LaRouche is saying, and what I think is absolutely clear, is that the American people spoke on November 8th. And if you realize the East Coast and the West Coast spoke for Hillary, but the rest of the country said, we're tired of being lectured to. We're tired of these arrogant elites telling us what to do and ruining our lives. The people spoke, and they said, we want to give Trump a chance to do something. Many of the people who voted for Trump, the fake news story that it's all racist and neo-Nazis, a lot of the people who voted for Trump in the Middle West, the so-called Rust Belt, voted for Bill Clinton and for Barack Obama. So you have a potential to create a new majority around this industrial recovery policy, around an economic nationalist policy. And Trump needs to pull that together. But we, the people, need to be continuing to speak out and to be heard on this. And a part of my activity is, and LaRouche PAC is designed to give people the understanding of how this could be done, how we've had recoveries in the past, the importance of cutting-edge technology with infrastructure, the importance of a credit system as opposed to the existing debt system of funny money from the Federal Reserve. These kinds of questions people are beginning to pick up, but we've got to make it bigger and stronger so that Trump knows that if he moves on these things, he'll have the support of the American people.
Harley, I completely agree with you. I just want to go back a second to when you mentioned Russia and China, where, in the beginning of the campaign, through the election system, after the election system, they kept on bringing up Russia and Russian aggression, cyber attacks. Trump was in collusion with Russia, and they kept pushing this, and it hasn't been working. They have no proof whatsoever. And how you said the deep state is not going to give up. And what I've been seeing lately is that they moved their focus from Russia and China, and it looks like they moved it towards North Korea, maybe Iran also.
Yeah.
They're continually pushing the idea that North Korea is this huge threat. Now, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but we can see that the U.S. right now is not doing anything to calm the situation down. I mean, actually, the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said that when China said, North Korea and the United States, they're heading into a nuclear collision, maybe you should speak to each other. Nikki Haley said that we do not want to speak to North Korea. We're going to go ahead with our drills in South Korea, and we're actually not going to have talks with North Korea, which I think is a big, big mistake. And it makes me think, what are we trying to do here, and why don't we want to speak to North Korea? Isn't that the first step for peace?
Well, let's take a couple things into consideration. In South Korea, there's going to be a new government. And we don't know at this point whether they're going to go along with the previous government, which turned itself into a puppet of the deep state. So maybe the South Korean situation changes. But I'll tell you what would change everything. Trump should meet with Putin sooner rather than later. Let's just cut through all this nonsense and get them together and talk about some things. And I think the Russians could straighten out the United States on Iran. I don't know if you saw this, but it was very interesting. Netanyahu went up to meet with Putin, and he's trying to play nice because he's worried about the 1 million Russian Jews in Israel, many of whom still like Putin. And what did Putin say? He said, this is not the Iran of 2,500 years ago, and you should change your view on this. I think if Putin could be the bridge here, and something significant that happened that was almost completely ignored in the U.S. media was the meeting between Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with Gerasimov, the chairman of the Russian Chief of Staff, and the Turkish military chief. They had a 2-day meeting to discuss cooperation against ISIS and al-Qaeda. Now, this is a change on the ground. If the U.S. starts cooperating with Russia, As Trump said, when we have areas where we have common interests, why shouldn't we be talking? I think on those circumstances, Putin can make his case to Trump why you shouldn't be worried about Iran. We should talk to North Korea. And in the meantime, we've got a bigger problem. The whole financial system in the West is about to collapse. Putin has been warning about this for a long time. That's the whole reason he refused to open the doors to for the EU to come into Russia. I mean, Putin's comment was very poignant. He said, when he was asked, why don't you want to invest in Eurobonds? He said, why would I eat someone else's spoiled food? It will just give us indigestion. And what the Russians are saying now is, and this is where Germany becomes important. What I've found in Germany is the people who are sick and tired of the sanctions are the German Mittelstand. These are the small and medium enterprises that are the center of Germany's economic resurgence after World War II. Engineering, science, technology, machine tools, the auto sector, chemical sector. They're the ones who are getting slaughtered by the sanctions because they had huge trade going with Russia. And so they're asking the question, why, because Obama decided to put a gang of neo-Nazis in power in Kiev and start rattling sabers against Russia, why should we have sanctions against Russia? And so there's a big push from a whole sector of the German industrial community to change that and reopen discussions with Russia. Now, that in the context of what Trump could do with Putin could mean a totally dramatic shift in Europe. If Europe and the United States were to work with Russia and China, then I don't think we'd have to worry about Iran or North Korea. The only part of the world that would be in danger is Wall Street and the City of London. And so that's what we're telling Trump he should do. Now, whether Trump listens to Lyndon LaRouche or not, we'll find out. There are a number of things he said which show that he at least is thinking on parallel way in terms of his attacks on the Bushes and the Clintons. But I think that, Dave, is to answer your question, absolutely they're going to try and use North Korea. They'll try and pull the trigger on something in Iran. The deep state requires war. Now, it's not just because they make money from it, which is the mistake some people make. They do make money. You have 100,000 consultants in the Washington, D.C. area who've become millionaires because of the trillions of dollars we've thrown into the Middle Eastern wars. But that's not the real point. There's an ideological commitment and a hatred of much of the rest of the world, including the American people, that come from these arrogant bastards and the so-called establishment. And they have to be taken away from any leverage over the institution of our government. And if Trump would do that, that would be the greatest service that he could do to the United States for now and for the future.
You mentioned Russia, China, North Korea, and Syria, and how we might be speaking to Russia about what has been going on in Syria. Now, Assad came out with a statement saying that the U.S. was not invited into Syria, because we know that the U.S. is bringing in about 2,500 troops into Kuwait, and they're prepared to go into Syria for this fight in Raqqa. And we know the goal of the deep state was to remove Assad or to split up Syria in any way they possibly can. When you look at what's going on, do you think on one side, Trump his administration is working with Russia? Because the statement from Assad doesn't seem like they are. Or do you think this is part of the deep state's plan to try to make their last ditch effort to try to do one of those two things, get rid of Assad or split up Syria?
I think Syria is the center of a bigger operation, which is to try and make sure that Russia and the United States never get together. And you go back to the murder of Gaddafi and the overthrow of Libya. They've run a whole series of operations, including the demonization of Assad, for the purposes of forcing the Russians to abandon Assad and to make a deal which would allow a continued primacy in the Middle East of the Anglo-American interests. Putin rejected that, and Putin went in and showed that if you commit yourself to a real war on terrorism, you can at least defeat militarily some of the terrorist forces. Now, the reason we haven't defeated all of the terrorist forces is that under Obama, the United States was arming them. the United States was allowing the Saudis to give them logistical support. The Israelis are involved in providing support to the terrorists. So this is where this bigger question comes in. Talk with Putin and move against this deep state. Now, I'm convinced that's why they targeted Michael Flynn. Flynn may have made a couple of mistakes, but talking to the Russian ambassador was not something that should have caused him to resign. He was targeted by Clapper and Brennan, the former director of national intelligence and the former CIA director, because Michael Flynn blew the story on Libya and Syria. Michael Flynn, when he was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, reported on the role in which the United States was using Libya as a transshipment center for weapons through Turkey to Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. And if Flynn were actually sitting there with Trump making policy, this could become very nasty because, as you know, Flynn was fired by Clapper. And Clapper is one of the people who was involved in this deep state operation against Trump, as we now are finding out last June and July when they first went to the FISA court to get some warrants against him. So I think this whole thing is a mess that needs to be clarified. And it's crucial that Trump be able to get his people on the ground, talk to the Russians. Now, part of the deep state operation is to make Trump's people afraid to talk to the Russians because it'll look like they're colluding with Russia and that Russia put Trump in power precisely for this purpose. And that's why Trump has to say, look, here's what happened. Under Obama, the United States was working with the terrorists. Under Obama, the United States was working with neo-Nazis in Ukraine. We used sanctions against Russia, not to change Russia, but to destroy Europe. So I think that Trump really has to lay the picture out. And that's also, by the way, the other plan the deep state has for him is if they can't impeach him, they want to kill him. I mean, in Europe, there have been half a dozen articles about the assassination of Trump. The editor of Die Zeit, a man named Joffe, did a television show, and they said, how do we deal with the Trump problem? And he said, murder in the White House. The London Spectator came out and said, we need an Aaron Burr or a John Wilkes Booth. You have some of this in the U.S. media as well. So they're trying to create an environment, and then you have these riots in Berkeley and some other places that look like Maidan Square. And Putin has said it looks like there's a Maidan Square type coup being directed against Trump. So how do you break that? You call Putin and say, look, let's get together immediately. Let's have some discussion of this thing, and let's see where it leads. And at the same time, you go public and say, here's why they're trying to do this against me. Because they don't want the United States and Russia working together. And this goes back to the old British goal of what was the original purpose of NATO, which was to keep the United States in Europe, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. If the Germans were to line up with Trump instead of opposing him, the way Merkel is lining up at present, if they were to line up with Trump, drop the sanctions against Russia, and have an honest discussion, I think a lot of this could be cleared up, and the deep state would go crazy because their necks are on the chopping block.
How far do you think the deep state will go? I mean, you mentioned assassination, and people have mentioned this before, but we also see that, Trump called out Obama about the wiretapping. I know from many reports, Obama went to the FISA court twice to try to get some type of wiretapping. And then we had the CIA with their Vault 7, which was leaked out by WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
When we look at all this, we can see that the CIA was not working for the best interests of the people. They were working for other interests. I mean, how far from everything that's coming out right now, what else do you think the deep state will do moving forward?
Well, they'll do whatever they have to do. They'll lie. They'll carry out assassinations, coups. I mean, this is what their experience is. But I was on an interview yesterday with Roger Stone, who's an old friend of Trump and an advisor to Trump. And Roger made an interesting point. He said, he was asked, well, is it likely that Obama personally was involved in going to the FISA court? And Roger said, well, probably, but it doesn't really matter. Nixon didn't plan Watergate, but he had to take the fall for it. And Roger's point was that there's now evidence, the New York Post ran this, now it's everywhere, that Obama has set up a war room with massive amounts of funds from George Soros. Valerie Jarrett moved into the war room, 2 miles from the White House, to plan civil disobedience. Loretta Lynch came out and compared it to people dying fighting for civil rights. So you have people who are planning insurrection. And it includes the top Obama people, Jarrett, Obama, Loretta Lynch, and the funder of all that, George Soros. So Trump has to get tough with these networks, and he has to come out and go after them. And this is where you see the cowardice and the problem in the Republican Party. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, for example, showed a little bit of courage. He did an attack on Soros the other day in the Senate, but it was over Soros's funding of operations in Macedonia. What about in Berkeley? What about in Washington, D.C.? Soros is funding an insurrection. So I think the deep state is capable of virtually anything, including, had Hillary been elected, they were prepared to go to nuclear war against Russia with the expectation that we could win a nuclear war. So their miscalculations when it comes to economics and strategic policy show that they're capable of anything. But I think that they're weak right now because there's a process of self-exposure going on. The fact that the Trump dossier came from an MI6 operative, and that the British are still defending Michael Steele as a competent person. The New York Times is covering the fact that there were authorizations of surveillance that caught Flynn and others, and leaking of classified documents. We've just got to take this material and force the issue. And I think this is where I like what Roger Stone said yesterday. He said there needs to be televised public hearings on these things. He said, I would welcome them. And I think this is where the deep state is making a mistake. They're expecting Trump to back down. And if he doesn't back down, and if the American people stay engaged, this could be the beginning of a new chapter of American history, where these networks that have run the country essentially since the assassination of Kennedy with no opposition, now they're running up against some opposition. They could be defeated and dismantled. So that's how I would look at it.
I mean, with Obama and Valerie Jarrett, Eric Holder with this war room, I think it was Robert Steele who said they're planning on something May 1st about this huge type of riots and protests across the country. I mean, what you're saying and what you've been talking about, do you think they're actually capable of maybe creating some type of civil war here in the U.S.?
I don't think they can marshal the forces they think they can. Obama says he has 30,000 people who are part of his Organize for America. But if you look at the last round, the Not My President's Day rallies, there were hundreds in Los Angeles, maybe a few thousand in Washington, the biggest demonstrations in New York. The rest of the country, it fizzled. I don't think, it's kind of hard for me to see Democrats who always distrusted or hated the deep state cheerleading on a CIA coup against the president. Now, some of them are doing that. But I think we also saw that the labor movement, a lot of union workers voted for Trump in the Middle West. So, but that's not how a Maidan coup works. A Maidan coup, if you look at what happened in Ukraine, is you get a bunch of empty-headed people who believe that going out in the streets to topple a government will bring about democracy. So you get enough of a crowd, and then the deep state comes in and carries out provocations, including killing people, and using that as an excuse to say we've got to take the government away from the current people in charge. That's what happened in Ukraine. It wasn't a popular revolution. It was a military coup in which Victoria Nuland, one of the neocons who was Hillary's deputy for European affairs at the State Department, was working with Soros, who was working with the CIA. She said we spent $5 billion on that coup. So, I don't think the idea of a civil war or that they have the forces But that's not how it works. The way it works is you create the provocations, and you do something like get rid of Trump, and then stick a gun to Pence's head and say, you're our guy now. So I think this is why it's important for Trump to be preemptive, to name the people who were part of the coup against him, and to identify the issue. The financial collapse is what's driving this operation against him. If he can make that connection for people, then he'll make it very difficult for them to carry out an assassination. But if he kind of goes in bits and pieces on it, he's setting himself up.
I agree with you. I would like to see the televised hearings and things like that. That would be very interesting, and I think it would spread around the country of what's really going on here. And that's if the corporate media actually televised it. I mean, I don't know, but I can see.
I think it's hard for them to hide these things now, Dave. I mean,
yeah.
Programs like yours, you may not have millions of people watching, but as Trump points out, CNN, MSNBC, they have a declining audience. The New York Times is a failing newspaper. So we're seeing, I forget this alt media stuff. We're just seeing a lot of individuals who are committed patriots who are finding ways to get a story out. And of course, they're under attack now with this idea that Facebook is going to determine who's responsible for fake news. I mean, I find this one of the biggest ironies of all, that Facebook essentially started so people could lie in order to have sex. So now they're supposed to be the guarantors of truth.
First of all, and whose truth is it? I mean, it depends on where you go for it. I mean, if we go back in time, you can see that if you go back to the government and you go back, let's say Obamacare, you're not going to lose your doctor, you're not going to lose your insurance. Well, the fact check says, yes, the government is right. And it turned out it was wrong. So,
Yeah, who lied?
Right. And also, right. And whose facts are you really checking? I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
But I think the important thing is that this is a moment of tremendous potential. And people who have for years been tracking the deep state, tracking the global bankers, and assuming they can't be beaten, this is the time to drop your skepticism, roll up your sleeves, and get into the fight. It's the best opportunity we've had in my lifetime to reverse this. And if we lose this opportunity because people are saying, oh, you're naive, they're so powerful, they control Trump. This is one of the lines out there. They control Trump. Roger Stone made another point in this interview yesterday, which I thought was quite interesting. He was asked, well, what about all these CFR types and neocons who are in and around the administration? And he said, well, so far they're not really determining policy. And he said, the rats are not driving the ship, but they're definitely on board. Now, we've got to drive the rats off the ship. That's what it comes down to.
That is true. We have to get rid of those individuals that are trying to move everything in a certain direction. And I think that's why Jeff Sessions was telling, 76 attorneys to resign in the Department of Justice. I think they're trying to get rid of all these individuals that are causing problems and not working for the best interest of the people of the United States. And
the American people at this point have concluded that what they don't want. They know they don't want more of the Obama, Bush, Hillary Clinton policy, but they still don't know exactly what they need. And, I applaud you for the work you're doing, bringing people something that goes beyond the simple story, but actually, we've got to get people to start thinking on this higher strategic level. And if a significant minority of the American people start thinking that way, then we'll be in business for this new paradigm that Mr. LaRouche has been talking about. If that doesn't happen, then this is going to be a miserable period ahead where we could go back into a confrontation toward World War III and a global financial collapse.
Harley, I really appreciate you taking the time out and speaking with me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Once again, how can people see your work or get in touch with you if they have questions?
Well, the best way is to go to LaRouchePAC.com. And we do have with LaRouchePAC.com a section called the Action section or Activity section where people can sign up for what's really a daily briefing, which is sort of like an editorial lead on events that are occurring. And if you give me a second, I can get a number where people can call also. We have a new hotline that people who want to do something can call in and say they heard this on the X22 report and they'd like to find out what they can do. And that number is 551-237-5311. So I'll repeat it. It's 551-237-5311. And one other option, if people want to contact me directly, I'll give out an email address, harleysch@gmail.com. I answer emails as quickly as I can, and what we've got to do is get people into this fight right now. So you can call that number, go to LaRouchePAC.com, and send me something, and let's see if we can get more people into this battle.
Fantastic. Harley, once again, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, Dave. Pleasure talking with you.
You too.